ka nui te mihi ki a rātou mā. Hoki mai ki a tātou te hunora, ka nui te mihi ki a tātou I tēnei ata. Mai tēnei taha o pāmutana, ka nui te mihi ki a tātou tēnei wā. Kia ora everyone, welcome to our panel discussion focusing on Māori economic development. Really pleased to have the opportunity to spend this time this morning with you and with our panel, our esteemed panel. I had the opportunity to, Susan asked me if I'd like to give a talk, and I thought, well, I'm going to find some mates to join this kōrero this morning. And I was very fortunate that some colleagues and friends have agreed to join us. So this morning we have some guests. Richard Jones will be joining us soon from Potama Trust. Now Richard has been involved in supporting Māori economic development for some time, particularly in terms of Māori small business, but more recently in terms of Māori collective enterprises in the primary sector, and forming and supporting Māori collaborations in a whole range of other sectors. We also are very pleased to have Pania Tyson Nathan, the Chief Executive of New Zealand Māori Tourism, who's a good friend of mine, and very pleased to have Pania along. Pania's had an extensive career in terms of supporting and working in Māori economic development, Māori economic development policy, and supporting tourism in communities, but also internationally as well. So we're very, very fortunate to have Pania along with us today. We're also very fortunate to have Kylie Ruwhiu-Karawana, who's based in Dunedin, but hails from Ngāpuhi, from up north. Kylie is both an operator, a Māori tourism operator, operating a family-owned tourism business, but is also a consultant in the tourism sector. And so our focus today is, given that we've got our esteemed colleagues here with a strong interest and focus and background in tourism, I think a lot of our conversation this morning will focus on tourism. So the format for today is really, I'm just going to make some opening remarks about our topic today, and then I'm going to hand it over to each of our panelists to share a few comments about themselves, to tell us a little bit more about themselves. In terms of where they were born and raised, so here it comes, Pan. This is what I'm after, is where you were born and raised, and a little bit about how you came into the roles that you find yourselves in terms of economic development and tourism and supporting Māori in the regions, but also internationally. And so, and then if you could sort of focus in your 5 to 7 minutes each, talk also about COVID-19, the impact that it's had on Māori enterprises that you work with or that you're actually part of, you know, the impact. And then, is there light at the end of the tunnel? And what does that look like for you in your, from your perspective of Māori economic development? And so that's really the format. And then from there, once each of the panelists have had their 5 minutes of fame and glory, then, was it 7 minutes? I'm not sure, it might be 7 minutes. And then I'm going to probe them with a couple more questions, but really open it up to our participants who are online at the moment. We've got 33 participants. Fire through some questions through the chat. And I think Patrick's going to help us with that, but I'm going to keep an eye on that as well. So do fire some through some questions so that we can find out a little bit more of these insights from our panelists. And that's really the format for today. So very pleased to have you all here. So on that basis, just a couple more comments about COVID-19, Māori economic development. I've been fortunate in my association with Economic Development New Zealand over the last couple of years to talk to some of the Economic Development Agency officials about what is Māori economic development and how do you engage with Māori around economic development in the regions. And very fortunate to have a look at that. And that was pre-COVID-19, you know, and the world has really changed a lot since then. And some of the assumptions that we've held about what economic development is and what it can be and what it should be have changed. And in some respects, it's a bit of an opportunity for us to rethink what's important and what do we actually define and regard as being economic development, and how do we approach it differently. So it's an opportunity in that sense. In the meantime, there's a lot of devastation there and impacts for our whānau, our businesses, our communities are really under the pump there. And so there's a lot of immediate attention that's required to support our businesses to pivot, I guess, is the kōrero, is the kupu, but really to find a way forward that works for them in their whānau and their communities. So all of those sorts of that sort of thinking about Māori economic development and general economic development, we need to rethink. And so it's really great that we've got this Congress that's going on here for us to kōrero about what that is. So that's enough from me. So I'm going to hand it over to Pania, then Kylie, and if Richard's online, then Richard, and otherwise we'll keep going. So and I'll find something to say if Richard doesn't show up. In fact, I might even talk for Richard if he's not here yet. So Pania, over to you.
Okay, tēnā tātou I ngā tini āhuatanga o te wā, ko Pania Tyson Nathan tōku ingoa no rongo mai wahine a hau, ko au te kai hautu o te rōpū tāpoi Māori o Aotearoa. Kia ora. So I hail from a settlement on the east coast called Mahia. And on my my Pākehā whakapapa, I come from Dunedin, so my ancestors came in 1848 on the Philip Lang. So big mihi to you, Kylie, down in Dunedin. So Māori economic development, where do we start? Jason was a baby and I was one of the older ones when Māori economic development was being discussed more seriously. I think Parikura and was running an organisation called Community Employment Group back in those days, and they, from memory, were the biggest supporters of the EDAs, as they were affectionately known back in the day. And we were in a very interesting space in that we were trying to understand ourselves as Māori, or probably how economic development became more prominent in terms of how and what we delivered to and for Māori and with Māori. I'm not really sure how things have changed or if they have progressed. Anyway, before I even go there, I'll do the COVID bit first. Suffice to say, tourism has been one of the hardest hit sectors, as everyone knows. And probably of late, I think I've come to the conclusion that COVID may have saved tourism from itself, but I'll get into that a bit more later on. It was interesting, we looked at our Māori tourism operators and we only had about 130 of our Māori tourism businesses apply for things like the wage subsidy and the wage subsidy extension, which was a big surprise to me. And at the same time, it wasn't. So when you were talking to Māori tourism businesses, they were saying, oh, no, we haven't applied. So-and-so down the road is worse off than us. And that was typical of so many of our businesses that didn't apply. So what did that look like in dollar terms? About $19.5 million. That was the wage sub and extension. Let's add another 5 million to that for businesses that we didn't know about that may have applied. So we estimate that our take from the wage sub was about 25 million. So that's tourism operators. And hospitality, our Māori hospitality businesses as well. One part of that makes me feel really proud, but more of me feels really worried because of the altruistic sort of rationale for not applying. What is difficult with Māori tourism is that when you're talking data, you get anything from we are 700 to 3,000 businesses. That's what the data will tell you. The difficulty about that is if there are 3,000, we certainly haven't contacted 3,000 businesses. We started talking to Māori tourism businesses back in February when the border closed to China. What was good was by the time we had lockdown, we'd spoken to almost, well over 400. So we had a pretty good idea about where people were at. What was good was people had come off the back of a very good summer. And that was about 85% of our businesses told us that. What is also good is a lot of our businesses hibernate during winter anyway. The concern is, and add to that, that a lot of our people are focused on domestic. It was the bigger businesses actually who had the exposure from the international market. So, light at the end of the tunnel, of course there is. What is going to be interesting, and we're seeing it happen already, is I think there's going to be a bit of a dogfight over regions trying to attract tourists, domestic tourists. And I'd say there's enough there for everyone, but yeah, it's easy for me to sit here in Wellington in an office with a job that I get paid for to pass comment on things like that. But, you know, I'm not the one that's got everything on the line, including my house. We were fortunate that ourselves, Potama, Māori Women's Development Inc. and FOMA came together very quickly to support our respective the businesses that we were all supporting. And that was great, really. And look, we wouldn't have got everything right. We did it very quickly. What was good, I think, was our people saw us working together. Jonesy's on board now, and Jonesy was lucky because I'm sure everyone thinks it was just Potama. And cut by Jonesy, who cares? The thing is we looked after our people. That was the main thing. And we've got what we're calling Māori Business Response 2, which is a continuation of what we were doing during COVID. And we've got Tāpoi Māori now, which is the Māori tourism response. What has happened, I think, for all of us is everyone is falling over themselves now for advice to people. I mean, my gosh, we are lucky in the sense that there's RBP for Africa, there's Qualmark, there's Tāpoi Māori, there's MBR2, there's EMA, and I'm sure significant gaps. But anyway, now, so that's our COVID response. Tourism, in the future of tourism, I made a comment earlier that I think COVID saved tourism from itself. New Zealand Māori tourism has been putting a proposition forward for about 5 years now that we were losing our social license. And I can give you 2 examples. Queenstown in a restaurant, going to the wharepaku, and at the back is a security guard standing over a manhole. What are you doing? And he says, oh, that the sewage has been coming up from, I'm like, are you kidding me? That was one thing. So we all know about the infrastructure issues. But more concerning is that people who were born and raised in Queenstown not being able to afford to live there anymore. That's sad. I said, so that's the Queenstown example. I said earlier, I come from Mahia. So during the summer, our resident population of 800 swells to 17,000 tourists. Within the last 10 years, the sewage system shed itself. So what happened was you've got a very small resident population with a mean income of 14 or 18,000, I can't remember what the figure was, having to pay 15,000 per household for the new sewage system that has been impacted on and by tourism. So everyone goes to Mahi, has a lovely holiday, and then goes home and leaves the bill for the locals to pay. And if you were lucky and you weren't able to afford to pay your 15,000 up front, which was almost everyone, the council would give you a loan at exorbitant interest to pay. And that's what I talk about, social license. So we had 5% year-on-year growth for about the last 10 years. And the interesting thing I found through COVID, because we were doing a lot of due diligence on New Zealand tourism companies, and those massive profits were not being reflected in the pay packets of our people. Now, when I'm talking our people, I'm not just talking Maori, I'm talking about employees who work for tourism businesses. Now, that's pretty shocking. And the cynic in me also understood a lot more, I think, or questioned a lot more, why international labour is so important to the tourism sector. Now, in my view, is that it's cheap. It's minimum wage stuff. So I'm even less impressed, and this is, for those of you who are in tourism, will know that unfortunately we're looked at as a low wage, low value sector. And we can't shake that. And after going through the due diligence process, I can understand why people still see us like that. So, you know, we've had some leaders like Ngai Tahu, Ngāti Awa, who decided a while ago that living wage was the minimum to pay our employees. Now that's good, but we haven't had enough of that across the sector. Is my 7 minutes up yet?
Yep.
Good. Because, yeah, I mean, I could go on forever, and I won't. I'll probably leave it there, and then we can do questions later. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Pania. There's some powerful comments and insights there, and lots of questions triggering off for me. So I'm sure the same for our viewers, our participants as well. So thank you very much for those opening comments and insights, Pania. We're going to switch to Kylie, and then we'll come back to Richard. So over to you, Kylie.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi kia koutou katoa, ko Kylie Ruwhiu-Karawana tōku ingoa, no Ngāpuhi ahau, kei o te puti ahau e noho ana. I am of Ngāpuhi descent, as Jason said, and I do live in Dunedin. Shout out to Pania. And I am a bit of a hybrid. I work within our whānau owned and operated Maori tourism business down here in Dunedin, but I'm also a consultant with TRC Tourism, and I specialise in Maori tourism business development and experience development. where I started with tourism in this industry I love, I started as the first Maori tourism graduate with Tourism New Zealand back in 2001. I was with Tourism New Zealand for almost 10 years, and I finished my career with them as the Maori Development Manager, working with Maori communities and helping them to see tourism as an economic enabler for themselves. I left about 2010 when I needed to come home when my father fell ill, sold my soul and worked for a multinational for 9 years so that I could do that. And in the last 2 years, we've started our Maori tourism business down here in Dunedin, and I've started to work for TRC. So I'm stepping back into that realm of helping Maori businesses, helping iwi, helping communities, Maori and non-Maori, I guess embrace and recognise tourism as an economic enabler for themselves, to provide economic pathways for themselves, or even just to explore the industry for potential opportunities in the future. So TRC, what we try to do is not just explore those economic pathways, but actually also help people to understand if tourism is the right industry for them. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. So I have clients at the moment who are iwi, some who are hapu, some who are whānau, some who are regions who are looking to develop destination management plans. We have a lot of people who are just simply trying to, I guess, upskill themselves now and pre-prepared for when tourism is able to take a stronger step forward, as opposed to the multiple steps back we've had to take in the last few months, specifically because of that global disruptor that's literally cut us off at the hips. It wasn't even at the knees. It took us out pretty high up in terms of the effect that it has had. So there's this whakatauki that goes around my head, and it has for many months now. Ka whate te tai ka pau te toria. So when the tide ebbs, the oyster catcher strikes. And I think that's what's happening right now. The tide has ebbed so far back. There's a lot of places for us to strike, and that's what's happening, and that's what I'm seeing. And I'm able to go in and help people to recognise, what is it within your business that you could be working on now, because this is the first time that you've had in many years to work on your business as opposed to in your business, and trying to get people to put value over volume. So, some of those concerns that Pania was raising, so it doesn't become about how many people we get to our destination, it becomes more about what is the value we provide, and utilising some of those smaller, more intimate experiences where Māori tourism absolutely rings the bell and is able to put that step forward and host a little bit more. I think it's an opportunity for us to learn from Māori tourism operators in tourism, because it is about collaborative advantage. And I think as Māori tourism operators, that's how we work. We work collaboratively. We are about trying to find opportunities to work closely with each other. And I think that would work for non-Māori operators and regions together. We need to work together. Te waka eke noa, we're all in this together, so let's try and find a way forward together. I don't think that silo approach that we've had in the past is going to be as successful as it might have been in the past. There is a lot of support out there, and Pania's rattled off more than I knew. So there's a lot of support, and there's a lot of people making the most of that support. So if there's operators or regions out there who can support operators to find their way to help and find their way to business support and to enable them to be stronger when that bounce comes, hopefully we can handle that bounce a bit better, where we don't see over tourism in destinations that can't handle it, where we do provide the opportunity to be more sustainable, to ensure that our natural cultural assets are supported and not hindered by our tourism industry. And I think, there is light at the end of the tunnel. There will be a bounce. I think the way that people will travel will change. The way that they will want to embrace or engage with our natural environments and our people will change. I don't think they're going to want to go to experiences with 500 of their closest whānau. They're going to want to have those smaller, more intimate, more storytelling, more bespoke experiences where they can actually engage with people and place in the right way, utilising stories and interpretation as a way to bring that forward. So we need to possibly change a little about how we've approached tourism in the past, potentially how we've marketed tourism in the past, and be a little bit more, I guess, open and more forthcoming. to embracing, you know, a different way of working, being more collaborative, and ensuring that as we work forward and work through this new world, we're building resiliency, and not just resiliency into our business, into our Māori tourism businesses or tourism businesses, but building resiliency into our communities and building resiliency into our industry. And that might be ensuring that we build a sense of purpose within our operations. So our tourism business down here in Dunedin, we do have a strong community benefit focus where we put money into predator control out on our peninsula, because that's where we go, and that's one of the jewels that we have, and we need to protect that. So it's taking that purpose brand element and infusing that within our industry. So I think that's possibly a quick rundown. Probably, I don't think I've missed anything, but I think that's all I have to say, because I do want to leave plenty of time for questions at the end.
All right, Kylie, no, great. Thank you very much for those insights and those opening comments and your experiences there. Really appreciate it. We're going to pivot now to Jonesy, as Pania affectionately calls him. So Richard Jones, over to you just to introduce yourself, where you were born and raised, the whole history in less than a couple of minutes. And then just to talk about, as we've heard from Pania and Kylie, a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 on Māori enterprise and the response and the light at the end of the tunnel. Over to you, Richard. Kia ora. Welcome. Oh, you got to unmute, e hoa. Kei te waha nui tonu. Kia ora.
Thanks, Jason. Kia ora, everyone. My name's Richard Jones. I was born and raised in Wellington, but I now live in Otorohanga, in the King Country, which is where my father's iwi is from, Ngāti Maniapoto, and my mother is from Te Arawa. I'm the CEO of Potama, been the CEO for close on 25 years. We're a small self-funded organisation of about 6 people. Working from home has been no big deal for us because we've been doing it for the last 25 years. So we're all working from home, and it's worked out well. But Potama operates off a platform of mobility and technology, except nowadays it's more technology because the mobile part of us has been kind of put on hold due to COVID. But in most cases, we're very mobile, getting out, dealing with businesses on a one-on-one basis and seeing the business in action, talking to the business owners about their issues, their challenges and opportunities. So that's how we've been tracking. In terms of COVID, yeah, it's been variable depending on what sector, what sort of business you're in. For example, I was with a storage and distribution business the other day, and they've been booming right since the beginning of COVID. And even now, you know, really busy. Oddly enough, they're busy storing and distributing lots of beer, which seems to be popular at these times. But then, you know, it impacts other businesses in different ways. You know, we're talking with a cleaning contractor because people are working at home. Not so much office space is being used, so their services aren't being required, and they've had to, you know, stand people down. So it affects different businesses in different ways, as many of you will probably know. We do a bit of work in the tourism sector. We've seen the impact there, quite sad in some respects. It's pretty helpless, can't do a thing for some people. Others have been able to, what's that word? You know, pivot. In Māori, we call it sidestep. Been able to sidestep, do the Māori sidestep, and head off into other directions. But that's not for everyone. Definitely there's a few hurting, and as with the hospitality business as well. So some of the things we've been working on for quite a while, and Kylie mentioned about collaboration, is that we're working on collaboration between sectors and sort of working on a trail from one end of New Zealand to the other that will combine food and beverage, tourism, fashion, IT, arts and craft, that sort of thing, trying to bring them together and you know, looking at different ways of tourism. One of the things that we know people are interested in is so-called industrial tourism. So people want to go and see a honey processing plant. You know, how do they extract the honey from the hive and put it into the jar? We're involved with a milk processing, geothermal powered milk processing plant as well. People want to come in and see that processing plant in action. So when we were building it, we made sure we set up viewing platforms and viewing windows. So yeah, different ways of looking at how can we enable tourism, but bring in these other sectors such as, I mean, tourism goes really well with food and beverage, as you probably all know, and some of you probably are food and beverage providers that leverage off tourism. Tourism goes well with fashion, arts and crafts. So what we're wanting to put together now is this trail from one end of New Zealand to the other, and not just Maori tourist operators or Maori businesses, any sort of business that would like to be part of this trail or connect into this trail is one way that we want to help that sector, not just that sector but others, and encourage Kiwis to get out and about. You know, I've got a friend in Queenstown, went down to Queenstown yesterday and was sort of saying, you know, they were moaning a bit because they can't go anywhere. So they went to Queenstown, they can't go out of the country. But I say, well, wow, there's lots of neat places in New Zealand that you can go to. You've got to just stop your narrow thinking and think broader. So I think Pania and Kylie have mentioned all their assistance out there, and there is a lot, but businesses don't necessarily know how to access that assistance. So we seem to be playing this almost like an honest broker role, and facilitating interaction between all these different assistance services, such as the IRD small business loan, the RBPs, the NZTs, all these acronyms. They're all out there, but you know, a business is often too busy just trying to keep their head above the water and don't know how to access these services. So that's been a big part of our role, particularly during COVID, with just helping them navigate these services or matching them. You know, you get one service one thing and another service another thing. So we've been really good at being able to match those different services for that particular business. Yeah, but you know, there's some sectors that it's not working so good for them, but there's others which are going on pretty well. And the Maori, I suppose what we call the Maori asset holding sector, has held up pretty well because a lot of them are in the food production side, always been conservative, so they've got healthy balance sheets, they've got a bit of cash reserves, and many of them, along with bringing in entrepreneurs and small business, see this as an opportunity for a reset and a different way of doing things. Hopefully that gives you a bit of an insight into what we've been up to over recent times.
Kia ora, Richard. Thanks very much for those opening remarks and what you've been involved with in supporting Māori enterprises, Māori economic development. Yes, so we've got some questions sort of rolling in. Happy to receive more questions, and so do share those questions. I'm going to kick it off for us now. So we've got until about the next sort of 20 minutes or so. I just wanted to go, I'm going to ask one each and then we'll see what comes through on the chat. So we're going to go back to Pania. Pania, you mentioned, you know, tourism is losing its social license, and I was just interested in your thoughts about how we can recover the social license that we require in order to address those issues that you mentioned, infrastructure challenges and equitable pay and sharing the sort of economic benefits that flow into or have flowed into tourism over the years. What's your views on how we can do that? So
I guess I define tourism, or people who work in tourism, as we're two types of people. We're either marketers or economists. So I say we're full of dreamers and bullshitters. So where we want to get to actually is when we say things, instead of being a strap line, you know, we have a strap line for bloody everything in tourism. So when we say something, we mean it and we'll do it. So when we talk about regional dispersal and say that it's really important, let's actually do that. So instead of coming up with an infrastructure plan, why don't we come up with a regional dispersal plan for a start? And you might find that the types of infrastructure you are going to be investing in might be less costly and actually of greater benefit right across the board. So there's one thing. Just look, I think it's as simple as I could give you an hour on this at least, but it's just about sharing it around. It's that simple. So that's number one. And two, when we talk about value over volume, understand what that means. I think the measurements that are in place are all wrong. Excuse me. So if for example, government gives, and I'm not bagging Tourism New Zealand, by the way, but if government gives Tourism New Zealand X number of dollars, and the KPI is the number of tourists, well, we're on a hiding to nothing, because that just encourages growth. We've got no problem with growth, but it's got to be the right sort of growth. Like, suffice to say, I think we should be brave enough to determine what sort of tourist we want here in New Zealand. And value and values should be aligned. So, and that is the value volume conversation. So, I can't remember your question, to be honest.
That's right. I think you've corrected, Pania.
Oh, good. Then I'm off.
No, really appreciate that, Pan. Thank you for that. Kylie, just if I can come to you, you mentioned a whakatauki he waka eke noa, collaboration, and how we kind of might achieve that at sort of different levels of tourism. Just interested in your thoughts or experiences of how we might sort of get there a little bit more with collaboration in the sector.
I think we've all the speakers today have kind of touched on it. It's all about ensuring that we are working together. What Pani was talking about before, changing what success means. Actually looking at a success metrics that talks about transferring visitors, along a pathway. So you are creating that regional success. That you've got a story thematic that runs in different directions, so you can actually start to, I guess, articulate a pathway for people to actually travel. I think being able to work together across sector, as Richard was talking about, is vitally important. We need to think outside the square. It's not just about driving them to the destinations we know that is set up for tourism and it's going to provide an opportunity for people to engage. I think it's about saying, well, is there an opportunity for the arts sector and the tourism sector, food, wine and beverage sector, and maybe even the sports sector? Let's all come together and think about some of the packages that we can put together and create those special, really niche opportunities to understand and engage with what New Zealand has to offer, that heart of what we have to offer. And yeah, I think we have to work together. Those conversations need to be had. And if those conversations aren't being had, then let's be strong enough to have those conversations. To Pania's point, do we want our cruise sector to come back the way it was? Dunedin, we relied on the cruise sector hugely, but some of them were only here for 4 or 5 hours. Wouldn't it be great to get smaller, more intimate cruise ships coming into the city that stay for 2 days? They get to see what we have to offer, really understand. So have those difficult questions quickly.
Kia ora. Kia ora. Thanks very much, Kylie. Appreciate that. Now if we could just pose one for you, Richard. You mentioned the I guess the trail, sort of connecting up the diversity of tourism businesses and related tourism businesses. How do we, what do you think some of the challenges might be and the opportunities might be from sort of connecting up that trail, having a tourism trail from the top to the south?
Yeah, it's always a challenge. I call it the challenge of 1,000 cups of tea, because that's what you got to have to get people on board. So inevitably, there's always pathfinders, the ones that want to step out in front, and so you focus on them and get them going, and then others, it's like FOMO, fear of missing out. Others start to come along as well. That's what we've found anyway with our collaborative efforts. But really, it always starts off with a few risk takers, innovators, entrepreneurs, pathfinders. They'll get things going, and then others start to come into that. And I guess it's being able to put a big picture forward as well. So our most recent collaboration is a hemp collaborative of 22 businesses, mainly Maori, but there's some non-Maori businesses in that collaboration as well, including New Zealand's largest farmer, Landcorp. So what attracted them to it was that we were able to put a good story forward of giving value back to landowners. So if they're going to grow hemp, they need to get a great economic return, or better economic return than what they're getting at the moment. But also understanding, what are you going to produce, and who's it going to be for? So we call that kind of like a land to brand strategy. And so if you try and put that big picture, there may be parts of that picture not quite clear yet, but you paint that picture, and that kind of sort of enthuses and motivates people to say, there is a bit of an end game here. And then you start putting the components of that picture in place. So we started the hemp group 2 years ago. Yesterday we signed an MOU with a large US company called Empire Holdings. It's HEMPYRE, which is a very science and research oriented organisation, but has got a number of products, and it's got channels to market. So we're kind of putting the market end of the picture together as well, and then we're starting to put the other components. So the one that probably be the last component of that is that we actually start growing the hemp. And so we put that picture out in front. That was 2 years ago, and now we're starting to paint components of that picture into the frame, so to speak. But it's, as I said, it's 1,000 cups of tea. You go down a lot of blind alleys. You have all sorts of characters pop up and pop in and pop out, and you just got a whole lot of dynamics you deal with. But if you keep your pretty much your vision ahead of you and keep aiming for that, then things start to fall in place. And what drops out of it, might be a whole lot of people who express interest firstly, but over time, the real players and the key players will remain in there and ride alongside you and support what you're doing. Is probably what we've experienced anyway.
Kia ora, Richard. Thanks very much for that. We've got a couple of questions rolling in, but keep them rolling in. And so one of them is from Jenna Lee, and she asks, embedding values like mana tangata, manaki manuhiri, rangatiratanga, kaitiakitanga, whanaungatanga, that sort of seems to resonate for her. How do we sort of progress the sort of embedding of these sorts of values in tourism sector and economic development going forward? Open to the panel.
Look, for me, I get a bit tired of hearing about all the tangas. They're just thrown around too loosely, and everyone seems to be grabbing hold of them without really understanding what they mean and what the values behind them. And I see certainly for Maori, not only in tourism, and I'll give you a good example with our dairy plant. We're looking at imagining if we go back 200 years ago, and Maori were a self-determining people from 200 years ago up until now, how would things have been? Well, we would have been doing things within our values, so we may not be in the environmental mess that we're in now. These are some of the things we're talking about. We're talking about farming under the maramataka, or the lunar calendar, and every aspect of our business, right through to the consumer, is infused with our values. That's probably some more newer thinking that's coming through, but I know Maori are tired of hearing about everyone grabbing hold of all these tangas, as we call them. and not really understanding the stories and the values behind them. Because I think if we start people, not only Maori, but whole of New Zealand, mainstream New Zealand, gets to understand these rich stories and these really strong values that underpin those stories, then I think we're heading towards a better space and a kind of new reality for what we do here in New Zealand. Similar to what is happening in tourism, volume over value. Well, in the food sector, particularly the export food sector, they've been banging on for years. Let's be price makers, not price takers, but hello. They want to send as much meat and as much dairy as they can into China, and it's all low value stuff. There's no real high value niche, food as a medicine, food as a health type thing going on. So that's what we're playing around with, our narrative as Maori food producers, and no doubt tourism and anything that Maori are involved in is really coming to grips and getting an understanding of what our kuia, kaumata, our tupuna have always held strong to living those values and bringing them into how we live, how we work within our daily lives.
Awesome.
Anyway.
Thank you, Richard. Appreciate that. Kylie.
I think something that stuck with me last year from the Tourism Summit was, I was going to say a young man, but he's not that young anymore because neither am I. But he came into the Māori Tourism Graduate Program a few years after I did. William Stewart, who runs Native Connections up in Whakatane. He said, don't take the tangas, take the tangata. So, bring more Māori into the sector and into roles where they are able to help embed some values, and so that you can understand those stories and you've got a deeper, richer understanding of what those values mean in a business context, but also in a cultural values context maybe. But I thought his, don't just take the tangas, take the tangata, stuck with me from last year. So I think I would reiterate that one.
Kia ora, thank you, Kylie. Tanya.
I totally agree with both Kylie and Richard. So rather than relitigate that, what I'd like to say to you, Jace, is next year, I think you need to bring Tamati Kruger on for a conversation, because it's a bit of the question about and the comments about the tangas, but also Tamati just presents such an interesting perspective on, what things mean today as opposed to what they actually meant yesterday. And so he would just be fascinating to listen to. And I'm not answering the question, but what I'm saying is we've got somebody amongst us. And when you're talking tourism, it is all about the whakapapa. And Tamati gets that. So I don't need to add anything to that. We use the tangas because it's inherently a part of who we are, rather than us trying to sell the tangas to anybody else. Kia ora.
Yeah. Thank you, Pan. And that's a very good suggestion. If we can get Tamati Kruger, the chairperson of Tūhoi Teuru Taumatua Trust in Taneatu, to join us for next year's conference, that'll be wonderful. And just by way of a bit of an advertisement, I just wrote a chapter on Te Mana Motuhake o Tūhoi and interviewed Tamati, and his philosophy runs throughout that chapter. They've put me out very soon. So I'll let you all know. I'll let Susan know. Here it is, and so hopefully you fellas can buy it.
Māori economic development right there.
It is. It's a good read, I tell you. But no, you're right, Pan. His philosophy is different. It's distinct and very insightful, very powerful. So appreciate that. Now, I'm looking for some more questions, people.
There's one on Australia that I think we could all provide a really interesting some thoughts about.
Yes,
Australia is, yes, ahead of the game in some things, but it's got a long way to go in terms of Indigenous and cultural experiences. And I mean, Jace, do you remember, it was back in the 90s, I think, and Richard Jonesy was there as well, when they took us up to that community and everyone was haurangi. That was the saddest thing. But that was the saddest thing I'd seen in my life.
Yeah.
And I could not believe that that was happening today, like in this century.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think one of the things they have done incredibly well is with their Indigenous art, you know, making authentic art available. I don't know if it's at all duty-free shops, but duty-free, and where you have the story available about, you know, there's information about the tribe, the artist, and that sort of thing. Now, that might seem like a really small thing, but art is, and storytelling is as much a part of their culture as it is ours. So, yes, I think they've done that really well, but respectfully, there's a long way to go, and I'll probably leave it at that. Jonesy, you've done quite a bit of work with them.
Yes. Richard, over to you, and then we'll come back to Kylie for a comment on Australia.
Well, I tried to do a bit of work with them. It didn't quite work out. I went over there a number of times and I saw their tourism, some of their tourism operations, which were quite large. And yeah, they were trying to infuse culture into some of those tourism operators. I think the one in Cairns, I can't remember what it's called now.
Yeah.
But yeah, they still had, that was a few years ago, and they still had a lot of work to do to really evolve that so that it was genuinely Aboriginal culture. And maybe they've done that since, I'm not sure. And then I saw some of the larger tourism organisations in the Northern Territory, some of their hotels and some of those national parks, but yeah, at that time, very minimal in terms of interaction with the culture. Well, it's more about interacting with the crocodiles, I think. And you know, those Aboriginals would have stories about those crocodiles, but at that time, they weren't being told. It was more about, you know, let's go for a cruise, see the crocodiles and throw them some food, and that was about it. But I'm pretty sure they had some really cool stories around those crocodiles. And I would hope by now it's evolved a lot more. I mean, that was like almost 10 years ago, I guess, where we were having a lot of interaction with them and we're trying to, you know, get something jointly going, but it never seemed to come off. And part of that, I feel, was they were very, very controlled by the government. You know, the government sort of, I mean, they had huge amounts of money going into it. They were on, you know, the government, and most of the operations that we visited, which are the larger ones, I dare say there's smaller Aboriginal ones that are quite, you know, focused on culture, but the larger ones were all run by white Australians, and the Aboriginals were like the workers. I ever saw many in management levels. So I think, yeah, hopefully it's improved, because when I was there, I thought the Aboriginals were in a very sad and dire situation.
Correct.
Got it, Richard. Thank you. Kylie?
I think one of the things I love about TRC is that Indigenous tourism forms part of our main focus around what we do with tourism. And that is in Australia. We are in Australia and in New Zealand. We work with Indigenous communities on country to actually help them develop economic pathways for themselves. But we also work, like we do here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we work with local government and agencies to understand purposeful engagement. How do you engage purposefully? How do you engage properly? And how do you take Indigenous communities on that journey so you're not at loggerheads when you come up with the solutions? So I think what I'm seeing now, and yes, I think there is still some issues with Indigenous tourism around the world, but in Australia is that there are organisations such as TRC who are really looking to create those opportunities for those Indigenous communities to benefit from tourism as an economic enabler, much as what the likes of the New Zealand team here are trying to do for multiple communities around Aotearoa, New Zealand. So that's what I love about TRC, and it is absolutely about giving them the opportunity to tell their stories in their country, in their way, and benefit from it themselves, as opposed to just getting a clip of the ticket. They want the ticket price themselves. So I think I am confident, not confident, I am hopeful that we will get to a stage where potentially some of our Indigenous partners over in Australia will be starting to see some of the benefits that our small, medium operators here in New Zealand hopefully are also going to be starting to see. I guess I'm a little bit more hopeful.
Kia ora, Kylie. It's wonderful. Now, just looking at the clock, my computer tells me we've got about a minute to go. Is that right, Susan?
Yes, Jason. Yes.
A minute. So I'm going to draw things to a close pretty much there. For me, I just really want to thank our panelists for their contributions, their insights, and their openness with their experiences, and about the challenges that we've experienced, but also about the potential going forward for Māori economic development and Māori tourism, but also the potential for partnerships between Māori, non-Māori, Indigenous, and Indigenous and non-Indigenous. I think that there's this wonderful scope for us to do some great things there for the benefit of our regions and our communities, and I'm looking forward to watching that unfold. So I really just want to mihi to our panelists, plus also EDNZ, Susan and Patrick for jacking this up and this whole week. So it's been a pleasure being here today. And for my part, just me to everyone, and hopefully you fellas have a wonderful rest of your day, and look forward to some more conversations about this kaupapa in the weeks and so forth going ahead. So kia ora, that's it from me.
Kia ora, Jason. Thanks very much, and thanks to Kylie, Pania, and Richard. That was a really great conversation. Extra good as I didn't even need to come in with any questions because you were able to facilitate them all yourselves, which is brilliant. So really great conversation and a good way to start the final day of the conference. So thank you very much. So we're going to move on to our next presentation this morning, which will be the last one we have before we have a break, and that's going to be Michael Bassett-Fox. I'm very pleased to introduce Michael. Michael's the Chief Exec of Te Waka and also formerly the Chair of the old EDNZ. It's great to have you here, Michael. Michael's going to talk about the Te Waka stories. So hopefully, Michael, you're able to jump on, and I'll pass the controls over to you.
Kia ora, Patrick, morena, i te whānau. So this presentation, Te Waka Story, is not surprisingly founded on a Māori proverb, Te tero whakamuri, haere whakamua. We look to the past to inform our future. So accordingly, I'll give you a brief history lesson of the Waikato region, key aspects which still underpin our economic and social fabric. I'll then pivot to some activity that Te Waka launched during COVID. And as I do this, I acknowledge that many of the activity is mirrored in other regions around the country, but just look at it through the lens of Waikato. It's celebration of launching a new EDA, Te Waka, and it is an expansive and diverse region that spans from Ruapehu in the south to Pokeno in the north and Kawhia in the west to Whitienga over in Coromandel, noting that Enterprise Great Lake Taupo does a sterling job, a key partner of ours in and around the Taupo region. It spans 10 councils. It's a limited liability company funded in thirds by the 10 councils, by government through the RBP program, and by large businesses and regional trusts. And I'll come back to this challenge that it raises as we look towards COVID recovery. So, Patrick, I'm going to share my screen now. and start with the historical account. So Waikato and its people are kaitiaki of Kingitanga, the Maori King movement. The Kingitanga, the most enduring political institution in New Zealand, was founded in 1858 when Waikato chief Potatau Te Wherewhere was nominated as king. The Kingitanga brought unity for Māori under a single sovereign to stop wars and unite the tribes of New Zealand. We derive our name from the Waikato River, the longest river in New Zealand, spanning 425 kilometres, starting at Waikato Iti and finishing at the mouth, Port Waikato. Kingitanga, our values and our history continue to link us to the Waikato River, its communities, and not just our region, the regions across the country and the world. The Waikato River was the primary route for travel and communication. In fact, many of our towns and communities prospered from trading along the river, the trading of flax, flour, and freshwater food. The swamps and streams fed the river, also providing abundant biodiversity, resources, and the plains on either side provided soils and gravels to cultivate food such as kumara, and introduced potato, wheat, corn, oats, fruit. It's from this base that the microeconomies from within our region were built and provide a means for our region to trade inter-region and around the world. Waikato is an economic power, and key aspects, as I mentioned, still underpin the economic and social growth in the region. We're obviously well connected, not only by the river now, but by road and rail. We've got vast amounts of productive land that's cost competitive. He tangata, importantly, thriving sectors such as primary sector and logistics. And it's just a great place to live. So that's the plug for our fabulous new website, led by one of the team, Amy, recently as we launched. So I'm now going to pull up the slideshow proper, but go on to waikato.com and check out the website. So I'm moving now towards Te Waka's and the region's response to COVID, and I'll cover this by way of three themes. The first theme is regional connectivity and delivery. Clearly evident at the start of lockdown, and we heard this at the last presentation, that many organisations were falling over themselves to respond. Te Waka convened forums with agencies in an attempt to get alignment around the region. In partnership with many of our councils, we set up the Business Support Centre. It included a call centre. We launched a new micro website, partnered with Hamilton Waikato Tourism to launch the Mighty Waikato local campaign. We partnered with the Cambridge Chamber of Commerce also to launch a job matching website. Regional agencies responded, and it was heartening to see the enthusiasm for collaboration to align in support efforts. And I know this has been seen in other regions as well, but really, really heartening. You know, there's many agencies offering business-facing support around the region, and historically, Te Waka has operated a hub and spoke model where the business growth team members go out and about the region and periodically sit themselves in the local districts and provide business growth services. We took a sub-regional approach, which has been the lens previously, but formed three communities of learning. One in the Hamilton metro area, including Hamilton, Waikato and Waipa districts, the Eastern Bloc with Hauraki, Matamatapiaka and Thames Coromandel, the Southern Bloc with South Waikato, Otorohanga and Waitomo. Each of these sub-regions have similarities in their economic and obviously geographic construct. Involved in the communities of learning were RTOs, chambers of commerce, community development boards and business associations. We learnt quickly that where the best engagement, where the various agencies had the best collaboration was where the best business support was delivered. You know, it's the Aotearoa District Development Board that knows its businesses in High Street, or the Thames Business Association. They know which businesses are open, which businesses are struggling. They know the names and they're trusted by the business owners. They effectively became part of the business support centre I described before. They were making outgoing calls, directing businesses that required support to COVID support funding or other various support mechanisms. So this is an important aspect that we learned. The hub and spoke model of delivery took on a sub-regional focused with localised delivery provided by the local fronting business agencies. These agencies became local partners in the business support network, and our response efforts for business support were collaboratively better where we had better collaboration. During alert levels 3 and 4, the local agencies were a call-out function to the businesses, gathering intel, which were framed up into a regional framework and provided back with district-level information. So a huge learning for us. I'm going to move on to the second theme, Māori economic development, which has always been a key aspect of our work program. We partner with Māori-centric business organisations, the various iwi and Waikato, Te Humeka, the Waikato Māori Business Association, Ake Komako, the Māori orientated business startup and accelerator run out of Te Wānanga or Aotearoa, TPK and many others, to formulate the economic development agenda and to deliver. So pre-COVID, the focus was on Te Whare Ohahoha, the Waikato Region Māori Economic Development Action Plan, launched by Minister Mahuta, where over the last year, 20 of the 22 actions have actually been delivered already, and the last 2 still in progress. But naturally with COVID, like many of us, the focus was sharpened. We participated in Tainui Waka iwi leadership and COVID response forums to support improved delivery of service for Māori. We prioritised support for SMEs, for Māori enterprises, including partnering with iwi to support tribal member and whānau enterprise. We supported more than 130 Māori SMEs and with funding directly or within market connections for business continuity. We've narrowed the focus moving forward even further. It's based on social procurement and supplier diversity, and I know that there's many others involved in this space as well. Powering up the Māori SMEs, training and upskilling as key drivers, and we continue to partner with TPK, MSD, Tainui Waka iwi, He Waka Ikanoa to implement this program, and that's our focus for the next recovery period. So the third theme I'm going to focus on now is forums. That's actually not our forum, that's WinTech gathering of students. Partnered with Rocket Spark during lockdown to deliver free websites for businesses. Great initiative. But we ran our own forums, and one of them was with economic experts, both in region and nationally. And we met with them 3 times a week at the start. The situation was changing really rapidly, and we were struggling to get hold of information, up-to-date, real-time information. And it was needed down to district level. In our case, we needed that granularity because the impact was affecting different districts in different ways. Obviously in Coromandel, it was a tourism story, much like Aotearoa and Waitomo. It was a forestry issue in South Waikato, a drought challenge in Hauraki. Major events were cancelled in Waipa with Karapiro and field days, and manufacturing in and around Hamilton. So the economic experts supported us to launch a snapshot, an economic snapshot. We call it the economic radar. We put it out weekly at the start, and it continues to evolve. And moving forward, for example, we're likely to add commercial leases advertised as one of the key metrics because that'll give us a view on empty office space around the region. I'm just going to pull up one of the bits of information. We can see the typical U-shaped COVID impact on the Waikato region. Those lines represent 10 districts in the Waikato. But when you drill a bit deeper, the impact of COVID had a district level spread of its impact between 40 and 70%. Obviously, urban areas like Hamilton and Waikato district did better during lockdown because they had the essential service businesses like supermarkets, primarily. Tourism predominated districts like Otorohanga and Waitomo fared worst. But coming out of lockdown, the trend reversed. Once Aucklanders could start travelling to Thames Coromandel and Taupo, they surged to the top. And we've just seen over the last, probably underneath some of the video links and many of your screens, the last couple of weeks, the impact of Auckland going into level 3 and level 2 in Waikato, and you can actually start to measure the impact of these levels across the region. So I'm just going to change focus now, and I'm going to look forward and how Waikato and Te Waka focus as we move towards COVID recovery. First is sector orientation, and we all know that sectors were impacted differently by COVID, which therefore requires a sector orientated response to recovery. As alluded to at the start, Waikato is strong in food production with abundant fertile land. Manufacturing and expert industries are strong. Its geographic location supports construction. It's been the fastest growing region in the tech sector nationally for the last couple of years. Education and healthcare are strong. It's a well-diversified economy and is less reliant on international tourism relative to some other regions. So it's holding up well, as can be expected. So we are already working with sector leaders to identify some of the bottlenecks and the challenges and some of the opportunities in implementing where we can with our meagre resources and where we can make the most impact, because in some sectors we obviously can't make a lot of impact. The second area of focus, or a second area of focus, is continuing to develop our capability around intelligence. And we're excited, and I know you will be too, that we, over the last few weeks, have run a business sentiment survey. It's the first of its kind in Waikato. We'll release the results in the next couple of days. We had nearly 600 responses, and that was down to running it in partnership with the local agencies around the regions. And what this did is it drove up survey responses because the localized or the local business-facing agencies took ownership of ensuring they got enough data to get district-level information, and we've also got sector-level responses coming through too. So the initial cut of the data is actually really quite revealing. So keep your eyes peeled for that release in the next couple of days. So just the last comment I'll make is around a reality check as we move forward, and a point of reflection around relationship management, which is, takes a lot of resourcing, and regional economic development sustainability. We aspire to lock in the learnings of localised delivery in partnership with local business-facing agencies to really amplify the economic development outcomes on the ground. What we're seeing is agencies, councils and others reverting to business as usual, and we were doing it too, losing the value of collaboration. Councils are bolstering their own economic development teams in response, which risks increased fragmentation and unaligned work programs. We're seeing increased separation between the metro and the national agendas, larger councils concerned that they underwrite support out in the region, and regional councils concerned of the focus in the metro areas, which are big drivers nonetheless. On the central government side, we see central government agencies increasing their agendas, resourcing and bolstering their staff in the regions as well, which is good to see the support. But we just risk losing the national level framework with localised and on the ground and the ground up delivery of programs. And obviously with centralised funding, as we all know, comes increased control. We also see tension amongst industry and central and local government. PGF and shovel-ready projects have caused delays in business as usual, impacting jobs. Local government and other project owners have been uncertain as to whether they should start programs, and local and central government are seen as bottlenecks in some cases to getting jobs going. The economic development model is challenged, it's fragmented, and it dilutes efforts from a regional basis to attract the attention from government. This slide was a bit of work that PwC collected for us. It's a view of economic development agency funding across the country. And I know that these, amongst the subtleties, there's some random effects occurring there, but the message is clear that not all regions are the same when it comes to delivering economic development. So the Waikato, we've made a huge start, and we should celebrate that and coming together, but we've got a long way to go. You know, much of the learnings about how we collaborate from localised delivery under a regional framework, it also has relevance in the national context. The Regional Business Partners Program demonstrates how government can disperse funds to businesses in regions, and when called upon with COVID, the RBP program stood up and it delivered. This is a national program delivered locally. A lot more can be done with centralised development of economic development funding into the regions with devolved funding and bottom-up approach, the bottom meeting the top. This would take away the short-term and uncertain nature of program funding, especially when it starts to come from businesses. The triennium conversations with local authority that drives constant cycle of change in economic development models in the region, and a much more sustainable and long-term program of funding from government is needed to sustain long-term and more efficient run economic development right across the country. But back in Waikato, after 2 years in operation, coming together as a region, now is not the time to make changes, not the time to revert to business as usual. Peter Harris made note of this on Tuesday. Now's the time for all parties to get into the waka and get an aligned program. So with that, Patrick, I'll stop my presentation and hand back to you, and I'll certainly welcome questions.
Thanks very much, Michael. A really interesting presentation there. There are a couple of kind of questions that I think it sort of suggests that also tie to some of the themes that we've been talking about over the last couple of days, which I know you'll recognise. I mean, you talked there a little bit about some of the challenges of the sort of economic development funding model, which we're all sort of used to. If you were thinking about you know, PGF round 2, whatever that kind of might look like, and recognizing some of the challenges that you have sort of outlined in terms of sort of accessing that funding, we've heard sort of, you know, two politicians this week talking about the importance of regional development, the need to invest in regional development. Obviously, too early to give any commitments to what that might look like. But what would your suggestions be, building on what you've already said, for a fit-for-purpose model that might apply across the regions?
Firstly, you know, you've got to applaud the current coalition for their support of the regions. You know, the PGF, when it was set up, was aimed to get money out into the regions, and to a large degree, you know, it's certainly splashed money around, which is good. But there's been inherent challenges in that, and I think we're all well aware of that. You know, from my view, it's the local communities and the key stakeholders in those communities which understand the projects that will offer the best and biggest impact to their communities, their districts and their regions. And so I think there is a need for much greater collaboration, and this is the bottom-up versus top-down approach to supporting initiatives that will actually have the biggest impact on the ground. And, you know, in Waikato, we're blessed with a lot of focus on the Hamilton to Auckland corridor, which offers huge benefits, not only immediate around construction, but longer term around driving economic development and jobs, but that project is a lot bigger, or the series of projects bundled in it are a lot bigger than, say, a Kiwi house in Aotearoa or a trades trading centre in Tokoroa. So getting this sub-regional or even district level view on the priorities that will have put jobs in places in the region where they're needed most.
That's good. I think the point about that kind of connectivity to other parts of the Upper North Island is quite important. I mean, I think the sort of functional economic area for the Waikato kind of extends in multiple directions with different issues. I mean, so given that, how has how's Te Waka working with some of those surrounding EDAs on sort of these cross-regional projects like the Hamilton to Auckland corridor, as you said?
I think we've got a lot of improvement to do, to be honest, Patrick. We're funded locally to a large extent, so the focus is naturally locally. I'm seeing good glimmers of hope. We're having good discussions with Priority 1 and Bay of Plenty. There's a lot of benefit to be gained from improved connectivity between Waikato and across to the Bay of Plenty. Naturally, there's common alliance with ATEED and the agencies for the Hamilton to Auckland corridor, and we've got a wonderful partnership with Enterprise Great Lakes and the great work they do in Taupo. And we know that business and economic development doesn't have boundaries, and take forestry as the example, which extends up into South Waikato strongly, but it's very strong in Rotorua and in and around Taupo as well. So I can see great glimmers and progress. We've got a long way to go.
And yes, it's always a journey, I think, for all of us, and moving some of these projects forward, given the time frame around economic development. The other question that sort of occurs to me is there's obviously a lot of focus right now on the importance of economic development and on having capability to deliver economic development across New Zealand and across our regions. And in the first couple of days of the Congress, there was quite a lot of conversation about sort of, the fiscal transfer from central government, empowering the regions, etc. One of the things that'd be quite interesting to get you to reflect on is obviously the way in which Te Waka has been established is quite different from some economic development agencies, which surely has some pluses and minuses, and it would be helpful to get your observations on sort of what works well with your current structure and much more sort of stronger private sector, ownership, leadership, etc., and what sort of do you find sort of holds that model back a bit?
Yeah, sure, Patrick. At the outset, I'll acknowledge that there's no right and wrong answer with this. And the region is because you need localised, ground-up approach to a big part of the delivery of economic development initiatives. So local stakeholders will have a say in how these arrangements and models are formed, which is one of the inherent challenges we've got. So I'm not suggesting we've got it right or wrong, but we can look across for common areas of success. There is a natural tension between industry and local central government. I think Te Waka is learning and was set up to be independent, whilst at the same time acknowledging that it's local and central government are key stakeholders and absolutely funders, which comes with it some obligations. So I think the ability of an economic development agency to have its independence and to be able to represent the voice of industry and provide that intel back into central government and local government so they can make their decisions, I think is quite empowering. Yeah, so that's a personal view.
Yeah, no, that's great. Michael, thank you very much for your time this morning. That's been very helpful. And I'd just like to say, I guess, to everybody here, we've got a bit of a break now, and the next session is with the Honourable Shane Jones at 2 p.m. Fingers crossed that he's able to make it on time for that session, and we look forward to having you back here this afternoon for the final few sessions of the Congress this week. Great to have you all back for this last session of Congress 2020. It's nice to see you all coming back online. I hope you enjoyed the conversations this morning and are looking forward to the ones this afternoon. We've still got a great couple of speakers before the end of the day on Friday, so it's good to see you here. We're very lucky to have been able to get for this sort of final session of the afternoon the Honourable Shane Jones, who needs no introduction, but most of you all know he's the Minister for Economic Development, which is of most importance to us, as well as a number of other kind of key portfolios that he holds. We were lucky enough to have Shane speak a couple of years ago at the Economic Development Conference that we held in Northland. So it's great to be able to get his reflections on how regional economic development has been moving forward since that period, and what he looks forward to next in terms of the future and the future of regional economic development. Usual process applies, and I'll ask you all to turn off your microphones and kind of turn off your speakers so as not to distract our speaker. If you have questions, the Minister has indicated he's happy to stop at any point in the conversation to pick up key issues. So please feel free to either post a question so that we can pull them together. You can either do that to the group or you can post things to me, and I can always chip in as required. But otherwise, the usual thing, we'll go through the presentation and then there'll be some time for conversations at the end. So with those sort of introductions done, I'd like to hand it over to the Honourable Shane Jones. Thank you very much for joining us. It's great to have you here, and I'll leave you in your safe hands for now.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much for inviting me. What I will cover off is partly political, obviously because you're interested in the facts as we see them in the event that we're blessed enough to come back into politics after the election. And I would like to share with you some learnings and some insights that I've gathered during the period of time I've been the steward of the Provincial Growth Fund and the Minister of Infrastructure. And look, I'm really willing to engage in any questions. I'm not expecting people on this call to agree with everything that we've endeavoured to do. But just to recap, seems like an age ago, in 2017, where we embarked on quite a profound mission. And I want to say up front, you can contrast what we have done and I have done with the approach perhaps taken by other funds and other ways of allocating money out of government. And we made a deliberate attempt to stand up a provincial growth fund kaupapa in a remarkably short period of time because we were driven to get dough out the door. That in itself, I must confess, is work still in progress. You can contrast that to the approach that my my cabinet, or my political colleague, shall I say, Mr. James Shaw took, where they set up a $100 million green fund, and they took a gestation period of an enormously longer period of time than we took. Calvin Davis has also been responsible for allocating the tourism fund, figuratively speaking. So the first point I'd make is that once we formed the last government, the coalition agreement was bedded down. I was very keen to get cracking and to work on those areas that we determined to be surge areas, not exclusively, and build on the ideas and build on the proposals that had been floating around under the regime of John Key, Bill English, and Stephen Joyce. Some critics have said, well, that wasn't future orientated enough. That was based on a very orthodox approach of picking up those plans and those entreaties that had never been funded. But be that as it may, I didn't want to be capricious. We, as you may know, had quite clearly identified infrastructure to be a key enabler in provincial growth. Although we had permission to drive money into more risky ventures, including this private enterprise, I found that the majority of the drive coming from stakeholders was for what I'd call grey infrastructure and, quite frankly, areas that had been neglected. Criticisms, I have been criticised for not delegating would possibly be the right word, or actually handing over the fund to the economic development agencies within different regions and getting them, whether it was 10 regions, hand them out $100 million a year and get them to make the decisions and manage the process. I was never going to agree with that. That would be 10 sets of different economic cost centres. And what we were looking for was a more systematic approach from within central government. And probably because it had never been done before, there's never been $1 billion per year, identified and brought into key regional stakeholders. So I just was not going to do that. And there was no appetite, quite frankly, for any other government minister to do that. That may change amongst a future set of politicians. They may find that it's better that central government and MB and ministers not make these calls, that we just hand the dough over under certain contractual terms to EDAs or chambers of commerce. That's for a future government. But I personally, over the last 3 years, I have not been supportive of that idea. That's not to say we didn't want to work with EDAs or even fund them to work with applicants and stakeholders. Anyway, I'm repeating myself. In respect of the future New Zealand First, and I presume you're keen to hear this, my leader, Winston Peters, has already identified that if we do have an opportunity to come back into power, he wants to see more on our behalf of an industry approach, identifying how we can actually collaborate and attract more pūtea into industries. I don't think that is possible unless we change the law. So he announced yesterday that aquaculture, which is a type of infrastructure, ought to be focused on. And our preference is to see the Crown de-risk offshore aquaculture, but do it in such a way where we're collaborating with other investors, whether they're private investors in a generic sense or local Maori investors. Now, without, I think, having a bespoke piece of aquaculture legislation that declutters the process and makes it rational, in the sense that people can have rational expectations when they'd ever get a statutory consent. So it's one thing to have the money, it's another thing to have a process in a post-COVID environment that gives people the confidence that they'll actually get permission to invest and occupy public space off the coastline of New Zealand. Digital connectivity is one also that has attracted more attention from New Zealand First, and try living where I live in the Taitohero, and although we've only got 190,000 people up here, we have a lot of, if I use my area as an example, we do have a lot of dead spots. So I think a future provincial growth fund may look different, and it will look different because there'll be a different government, but there's no reason why it doesn't focus on those particular areas where we know from our learnings have been key enablers. On the question of appetite to work with EDAs and work with Chamber of Commerce, I suspect that our level of confidence as to how to manage the process is now a lot stronger. I can't speak for the bureaucracy who work for MB and who service me. They're no doubt busily writing briefings for a new incoming government, whether or not they would share these views, but I have a larger degree of confidence now that we can work a lot more I don't know if the future government would be keen to break a fund up and hand it out into different regions. It may. I'd need a lot of convincing that that was worth doing. But I think there's a case now for a lot more engagement and perhaps the relocation of staff out of Wellington into the regions. In the context of how COVID has affected my region, well, the most recent lockdown turned Northland into a hermit kingdom because people were unable to come in and out. That raises a deep question as to how do we move to a situation if the disease is still in the community, how do we avoid the brutal effects of total lockdown and keep a moderate level of restrictions upon business and the community, whilst at the same time allowing commerce to function. And there's a hell of a lot of lessons for me and in Northland with the domestic borders, Susan, that were created, Patrick, that were created during the Auckland lockdown. It had a bad impact on a lot of our primary produce people. And whether or not the health department was the right people to manage that. But under our COVID legislation, as you know, the health department have a, if not predominant, then they have a critical influence as to what advice they give the government as to how restrictive our approaches should be. I might wind up and just remind people what we've spent money on. Over the last 3 years, we've endeavoured to pump money into grey infrastructure, more recently into green infrastructure, because the $400 or $500 million that went to Te Ururako, which is kind of what I call green infrastructure, that came out of the Provincial Growth Fund. That was the source of the dough. And then there's wellbeing infrastructure, and that's the term that the Prime Minister, Right Honourable Jacinda Ardern, had encouraged us to employ through the shovel ready for the smaller projects that really have sought to enhance community infrastructure and the greater value that people are going to expect to see from that type of infrastructure in a post-COVID environment. I don't think we've seen the full impact of the COVID economic downturn here in the north yet. Much to my amazement, the level of activity and the cost of housing has continued to escalate. I unfortunately thought that it would moderate. I'm seeing the opposite. I speak to real estate agents all the time to extent that's economic development, and it is, and around the Bay of Islands. They are selling like hotcakes, but they cannot get enough listings. So the industries that would continue to be supported by us in terms of economic and regional development, I've talked about digital connectivity. We see a greater role for aquaculture. We see a greater value-added role for forestry. We want to continue to back, as we have through water storage, land use changes, in particular in areas such as Northland. And irrespective of where you sit on the ideological line, politically speaking, we'll continue to back coastal shipping, continue to back, as we already are, rail. And if you want to be a politician that endures in New Zealand, you can't turn your back on continuing to invest in roads. But in areas such as the Tairāwhiti, where it's got a very small population, the roads are under constant stress and pressure, I would prefer to invest, and I will be making announcements to that end, in the Blue Highway for the East Coast, and not continually having to go with a begging bowl to upgrade their roads to a standard that perhaps we see in the South Island. The final thing I would say is that there are a lot of other regional economic development initiatives that are going to be very influential that don't fall directly in the purview of economic development. That's the first one, is the investment that's got to go into local and regional government for 3 waters. That is enormous. We are talking billions of dollars there. And perhaps the other thing that I would refer to is the debate in New Zealand. If we've got limited pūtea, where do we direct it? So my colleagues from the National Party obviously feel that New Zealand will get the best return as a nation by continuing their trajectory of pouring dough into the Golden Triangle and perhaps extending it to Whangarei. I don't I don't share that view. I think that that area will attract investment and that area will attract capital on its own volition, but we've got to look after the Taipoutinis, the Invercargills, and the more parched areas, because the market will not look after them without some Crown underwrite. Unlike Hamilton, Tauranga and Auckland, that area is always going to do well because progressively more Kiwis and international migrants are going to want to live in that area. Look, Patrick, I might just stop there. I've covered off some of the historical things that we did through the fund. I've been open and covered off some of the areas that I know we've been criticised for. And I'm keen to take any questions as to what people think or unwanted advice as to what we should do in the future. But I would say my ability to influence that depends whether or not I'm still a politician in 6 weeks' time. And I don't want to get into that sort of topic. I was here more to talk about policy and economic thinking as opposed to electoral politics. So we'll leave that for another environment if that's your view, which is certainly my view. I don't want people starting to get too electorally worked up. I'd rather talk about the concepts and what we think to do conceptually, investment-wise in the future.
Great, thank you, Minister. And that fits with the type of conversations that we've been having this week. As you know, we are all interested practitioners as well as voters, and this is really a conversation for the practitioner side of us. A couple of things that sort of build on what you've said and have come out in the conversations earlier this week as well. So obviously you talked a little bit about the impacts of COVID and how that's impacting regions differently. And so obviously talked about the Tai Tokoro example there. And we know that what we've heard through the week is the difference is driven in part by different industrial structures in those regions. And if we think about a future of regional economic development, irrespective of who's in government, how do you see it finding the balance between the sort of national frameworks you were describing and the need to ensure that there is a kind of common, consistent approach, lots of, not multiple cost centres, and responding to those different regional circumstances?
Yeah, I suppose in a way we avoided that riddle when we formed the government, because our cabinet just identified, you may say arbitrarily, but it is what it is. We just identified 4 or 5 areas and called them surge areas where we would endeavour to direct a lot of our investment into. And I just remind everyone that thinking actually was informed by the Stephen Joyce, and I don't even want to personalise it, it was informed by the thinking of MB and I presume economic development experts. They identified those areas. They said, well, bugger it, we've got to start somewhere. Let's just start here. This time round, I think out of COVID, what I personally have been informed about and lobbied about, number one, digital connectivity is something that should be spread throughout the whole country. And some areas are served better than others. And it's incredibly important that that remain a national mission, and that national mission can devolve down into specific areas around Aotearoa, irrespective of whatever the economic endowments are. Secondly, New Zealand, well, I won't talk about New Zealand first, but as an NZ First MP, I believe that the primary produce sector is going to be absolutely essential to generate revenue going forward, and I don't see revenue being generated if we over-regulate. I don't see revenue being generated unless the Crown de-risks the ability of landowners to change economic activity, and that can only happen if there is water. And I think that you'll find that in the Hawke's Bay, that if we don't come up with a water solution there in the face of climate change and other challenges, I suspect that Hawke's Bay might actually stagnate. And certainly if the borders remain closed until there's a serum or a cure for the virus, then no government is going to want to open up our borders to bring in the necessary level of foreign workers. So I see that as being an existential threat. So I'll just go back. I've talked about water. I've talked about digital connectivity. I think all governments, Patrick, are going to want to focus on our roading infrastructure and our roading network. But I say to you, there's just not enough money under the current funding model unless we cut NZTA loose and allow it to raise dough itself, like Tainga Ora, and move it out of Crown core funding in the sense that how it's accounted for. But that's a big call, although we can move government departments around or government entities around. At the end of the day, it's still debt. But and I mean, I find a lot of these debates, ideologically speaking, about transport quite tiresome. And the other fourth thing I'd say is that, yes, each region through its proxies of local government and the Chamber of Commerce and the economic stakeholders should put their plans together. But those plans will never eventuate if we continue to over-regulate the activities that are important to those areas. Let me just go through some of them. As you know, I'm very pro-mining. I'm not part of the group of politicians who believes that stewardship land and dock land is tapu land. I don't believe that at all. I think dock land is a very narrow range of land in New Zealand, and the rest should be opened up for resource development subject to statutory consent. Secondly, I believe that marine farming is absolutely essential, and we should liberalise the approach enabling that to take place. So the theme I'm saying is that you should look to central government to deregulate, to enable regional activities to be pursued. My voice is a minority voice. If you talk to my colleagues from other political parties, they see that as an opportunity to despoil the environment. I see that as an opportunity to actually to remain solvent.
Some good points there, Shane. You made the point, which I think is quite interesting about, and I agree with you, that the amount of investment that's going in across government, whether it's into Three Waters and other bits of infrastructure, all has a impact on regional economic development outcomes. But of course, you'll have that experience that involves multiple departments, multiple ministers as well. So I'd be interested in your observations from the last period in government of actually how do you get better joined up collaboration across ministries, across different departments to get those best regional economic outcomes?
You only do that by having powerful politicians who overrule the bureaucracy. Without politicians who are willing to take a risk and lay down the law as to what they want happen, the situation you're describing will never ever happen. There is an inbuilt bias and risk aversion. People are concerned, they'll be more concerned about protecting their jobs. It's a totally human response, and that will worsen, in my view, in the COVID. I'm already seeing in the post-COVID experience for a lot of sluggish decision making, it's almost as if COVID never happened. And I mean, full marks to Grant Robertson. I never thought I would live to see the day, and I was by his side, someone just basically strong arm and say, right, we're spending 13 billion, and within 6 months, 13 billion was gone. And no one on this call will ever see that again. So irrespective of what we may think about Grant as a politician, as a minister, he was profound. Now, here we are sort of teeth gnashing over 10 million, 12 million, and bang, he came up with a proposal and 13 billion was gone in 6 months. So I tend not to worry any longer about the 500K or the 10 billion. I just want officials to follow a process that doesn't get me or any other decision maker in any legal jeopardy. But Grant Robertson proved to me that if you want to get dough into the economy, he's done it in a way that I've never ever seen in my lifetime, and I never will see again.
Yeah, please. So obviously you mentioned the sort of the issue around that decision that you needed to have strong central government in order to sort of implement things like the PGF. And I don't want to sort of debate that as such, but to pull a couple of themes from the questions that are coming through. So in summary, some countries, they have put quite a lot of emphasis on empowering regions, building capacity at the regional level. And you've said quite clearly you would need to be convinced. And so it'd be interesting to know what are some of the things that would help convince you that greater role and responsibility for EDAs, local government, chambers of commerce would be the right way to go?
I think a great test is blended capital. I mean, is there a case where investors, whether they're Maori, Pākehā, international, whoever they are they willing to put their own capital on the line? And then I would feel a lot more relaxed as a New Zealand politician putting the taxpayer capital at risk, providing that my fellow travellers, they're at risk as well. But there are very few regions in New Zealand where that level of confidence of that depth of capital is available. Like, let's go back and look at Westland Dairy. So did the Crown have an economic development role to play there? My officials advised me no, that international Chinese capital would solve that market problem, i.e. an undercapitalized cooperative, incredibly important to the community, incredibly important to the owners, the farmers. So the local capital wasn't in Westland. The officials said it's an inappropriate use of Crown capital to underwrite the redevelopment of Westland Dairy, so that strategic asset's no longer owned by New Zealanders. We still own the land, although the owners of the land, I should imagine, are obliged to continue to sell their milk at a stipulated price. So all I'm saying is that I'm always suspicious of a level of naivety when people talk to me about, oh, well, let's invest in local capacity and let's strengthen local capability, and then we'll see all these sort of investment decisions flow. That hasn't been my experience.
You talked a little bit about the sort of type of industries you'd like to see in the future. And there's been quite a lot of conversation this week as well around the opportunity to focus on value over volume, whether that's around tourism or whether that's around agriculture. From your perspective, where do you think the opportunities are in the future following COVID for New Zealand to be competitive globally? And then what does that look like in terms of some of the infrastructure? And I think you've touched upon some of those, but I'd be quite interested to take that kind of future-looking focus.
Yeah, I see it as being very, very, very foggy at the moment. Like if I look at, let's take an industry. Well, let's take fishing. There's been a collapse in a lot of our ordinary markets for the food service. So that's where a lot of the profit is. The profit's not necessarily in the supermarkets. The profit is in servicing the burgeoning middle class, large food service industries of the world. Well, they no longer, in terms of how I knew them, they no longer exist. So my advice to firms would be to initially batten down and identify what you can produce at an affordable rate and keep your cost structure under control, and do not pursue fanciful ideas about value added until you're sure that your business is actually robust enough to sustain a long period of COVID uncertainty, because the Crown is unable to continue to shell peas and pay out job subsidies or pay out wage subsidies. So that would be my first thing. And I'm sorry if I sound quite brutal, but I came from a business background, and I am naturally suspicious about all these glossy sustainability statements, and I've yet to see much evidence in our food industry how it's led to an inordinate growth in profit. What I've seen is that it's improved the language around brand, and it's improved the colour and the components of brand, but at the end of the day, brand has to lead to a sustainable large growth in net profit after tax. So always put me in a doubting Thomas category in that regard, and I've never ever hit that. That's why I'm right back to bog standard brass tacks basic industry. Having said that, it's up to people to take a risk with their own money, and what can the Crown do to incentivize that? Well, I say to you, we should be investing in water infrastructure so that the owners of IP, or those who desire to put money into new crops, into new types of food, know that at least they can outsource the responsibility for solving the water problems to the Crown. I think that's a great idea, and that should incentivize people in the food industry in the regions. I mean, I'm not talking about how factories and that operate in Auckland. But I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that I'm optimistic that in the short term, that a lot of our firms are going to be able to sustain themselves unless they take a very brutal approach to managing their businesses well. In respect of technology and creating ourselves as a Silicon Valley, I've never ever had either the expertise or the connections to drive that agenda, and I just go back to the ordinary principles of business for those firms as well. I was very disappointed by the Fonterra experience. So if someone as powerful as Fonterra had to write off all those billions of dollars with their pursuit of value added and a range of other things, that's always made me, not so much skeptical, but I'm an economic realist. So I would rather see ongoing profit, and it may not be far from a commodity, but it keeps us solvent. And boy, that's going to be the biggest test, economically speaking, development-wise, for a lot of our regional businesses, to maintain enough cash flow to keep people employed and to keep solvency.
Final question for me, unless anything else comes through from the audience. And then I think Susan's got a question as well. The thing I was going to ask you, Minister, was that you're very right, we're still in the eye of this storm and we still don't know what the other side looks like. But there's quite a lot of signs that New Zealand might be much more attractive in the future, whether that's to investment, to international students, to kind of global talent. But we also aspire to quality and to building back better. So from your perspective, what does New Zealand's global agenda look like post-COVID, wherever that might be?
I think there's two. Well, one prospect is that we will be a hermit kingdom for quite some time to come. I cannot see a group of politicians wanting to be too ambitious or indeed reckless and fully open up the border. I just don't see that unless we're absolutely confident that we can have people in the community who are potential spreaders and carriers of this disease and we can track them. Well, we're miles away from that at the moment. So I don't want to sound dramatic, but I do see us being something of a hermit kingdom for quite some time. That's the first thing. And then that raises profound challenges. Okay, how do we continue to sustain our economy whilst at the same time blocking the wholesale ebb and flow of people into our economy, with the exception of those who are desperately needed to keep businesses or perhaps sectors turning over. And then going forward, I know there's a question that why don't we envision ourselves or reimagine ourselves as, excuse me, as a destination or a platform where the rich and wealthy, with all their incredibly exciting ideas to the next frontier about how technology reinvents jobs, reinvents community. Yeah, I just think that's pie in the sky. I'm just saying to you as one Kiwi to others, let's get the basics right first. And at the moment, we haven't had the basics right and we've failed at the border.
Thanks. Susan, you had a question?
Yes, thanks, Patrick. Whether you leave sooner or later, can I ask what you want your legacy to be in your current role?
Oh, oh, thank you, Susan, for talking about sooner. Whether I'm returned back to politics in 6 weeks' time or not, I don't really want to. I don't want to offend anyone on the call, Susan. That's something that, as Kiwi citizens, you go away and work that out yourselves. But obviously, I've always been proud of my whakapapa. I've always been proud that, although I'm a Maori politician, I've been slightly different from other Maori politicians. Obviously, I don't look like a Maori for a start, but I grew up with my grandmother and speak the language just like I'm speaking English. So I've always wanted, on behalf of New Zealand First, in particular Winston Peters, to have left a platform in regions that strengthen the ability of both Māoridom and all the stakeholders in those regions to stand up and take it to the next level. And I've felt that in areas like Tairāwhiti, Taipōtini, Taitokero, we have been promised so much for so long, but the money never arrived. And good infrastructure investments that would never have been agreed to through a classical economic market model can be introduced. Now, whether it's in tourism, whether it's in logistics, whether it's in water, whether it's in human capital, I hope to be one day regarded as the politician who put it all on the line and shepherded forward decisions that would never ever have been made through a classic sort of market model.
Yeah, I think we've heard this week how from Caroline Tremaine that the PGF in New Zealand is the highest, if not one of the highest, then the highest per capita such fund across the globe. So you certainly have all of that legacy to be proud of.
Yeah, but hey, it's a legacy that should outlive this political cycle. I really mean that, folks, on this call. And let's face it, you're practitioners, and you'll see what the next epoch represents. And if there's one thing that I think you've got to know me, half the time I shoot myself in the foot, as you already know, and you're very polite and you never remind me of that. But the other part is that I've led with my chin. It was time for a new narrative to legitimise the involvement of the Crown chequebook in restoring the fortunes through strategic investments, largely in infrastructure, sometimes with a focus on Maori. And I didn't want to have any more reports. I didn't want to have MB people explaining to me why I couldn't do it. I wanted the support of Grant Robertson, and God knows I got it. If there's anything that I personally take as a legacy, is that Grant Robertson backed me. And there were possibly reasons why he shouldn't, but him and I pretty much did it together. And he had the backing of the Prime Minister, and I had the backing of Winston Peters. And at that point, I'm starting to sound like I'm on a pulpit, so I better shut up and check out and wish you all well. And tell everyone I didn't come to politics, okay? I just came to talk about the kaupapa and the things that I've endeavoured to do. So thank you very much, Patrick, Susan.
Thanks very much, Minister.
See you on the other side of October. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Yeah. Thanks very much. So we do have another session now, and we're going to hear from Kylie Ruwhiu-Karawana, who's the CEO of Enterprise Great Lakes Taupo, talking about the 4 well-beings and a community-led approach to economic recovery. Kylie, welcome. Very nice to see you and joining us for this afternoon's session. Looking forward to your presentation. So I will turn my camera off. I'll let you kind of do your stuff, and we'll come back for questions in a half an hour or so.
Fantastic. Thanks, Patrick, and kia ora e te whānau. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. Hopefully you guys can see me on the screen. I can't see myself. I just wanted to start very quickly, Patrick, by thanking you for your wonderful MC duties this week. I've really enjoyed the Congress, the virtual offering. Susan, wonderful job of putting it all together. And Patrick, I think the sessions that I've been able to enjoy, I've really valued your insight, especially in question time. So thank you for what has been an action-packed week. There's always like somebody that has to go last at these things, isn't there? And I always think that Friday afternoon speaking slot is the worst. So thanks for that, Susan. Really appreciate it. I just was going to spend hopefully about 20 minutes stepping you through our COVID recovery project. And the reason why I thought this might be of interest to some of you as colleagues and as fellow practitioners in economic development is the Taupo story took a slightly different approach to others in that we took a community-led approach and especially focused on applying the 4 well-beings to our recovery strategy. And in putting this presentation together, it's been an exercise in reflection for me. And I think it's also timely that we do pause and reflect. We've all been so damn busy just doing all of the stuff over the last few months, and actually we're going to lose some of that insight from the learning of the journey if we don't stop and pause and capture it. And I know that many of you in the presentations I've sat in this week have been through that same exercise. So Taupo he tupu ururua refers to regeneration, and it refers to a whakatauki that was applied to this project by one of our tūwharetoa kaumātua Te Kanua Pitaroi. And it refers to the regeneration, the natural regeneration of a forest after a fire has swept through, and how seedlings will find their way through the crusty and burned out earth to regenerate and reform the forest. So we thought that was quite a nice analogy for us to use for our project. And now, there we go. So just super quickly, I wanted to give you a snapshot about Taupō District. And my organisation. So we are an old school economic development agency formed back in 2007. So we're one of the older players in the game, as it were. We're an independent trust and not a CCO, arm's length to council, which is super helpful because we fight with them often. We operate under a 6-pillar strategy. We operate district-wide, so our district extends to the north to Mangakino and to the south to beyond Turangi. But we do work interregionally, and kia ora to Michael Bassett-Foss, if you're on the call, thank you for your kind words this morning. We work incredibly closely with our colleagues at Te Waka, up through the Waikato, and also right across the Bay of Plenty, and we were one of the founding partners to the Bay of Connections Regional Economic Alliance many years ago. We also work incredibly closely with our colleagues at the southern end of the district with Ruwhiu. So whilst we're in the centre of everywhere, we make sure that we work very closely with all of our regional partners. And my team of 3.25 FTE work incredibly hard, as we all do, trying to do all things for all people for economic development. Some headline stats to set the scene. Everything was going up pre-COVID. Populations, my favourite stat. Our long-range population forecasts by Stats New Zealand showed that our population would peak at 39,000 in the year 2038. We hit that 20 years earlier than predicted, and with that fast growth, of course, comes with some of the challenges of a quickly growing community that we had been facing and addressing. We'd been, like many of you, addressing challenges like housing and labour market functionality before everything changed. Taupō District is, again, like many of our regions and communities across this beautiful country of ours, a place of two halves. Our Taupō township economy is quite buoyant, and it hides the deprivation of many of our smaller communities, including Turangi and Mangakino. So often we have to fight to get those stories of deprivation heard and get them elevated to get intervention. Our economy, I couldn't do a great pie graph like Peter's one earlier in the week of Jimmy's pies. It made me very hungry, that shot. I've got an old school pie graph, which just shows our bigger contributors to the economy, both in terms of GDP and in employment. And the yellow bar is the one to sort of draw your attention to. So tourism employs 1 in 3 people in my community. 35% of our workforce are employed directly or indirectly in tourism-related fields. The sector only contributes about 17% to our economy. So in terms of productivity and yield, it's not as good as others. The flip side of that, the energy sector, 2% of our workforce, but yet 12% of our GDP. So on one side, lucky that we've got some really robust sectors in our community that weren't or haven't been as badly impacted by COVID-19, but very much challenged by the 1 in 3 workers in the tourism sector. So that was where we were looking at in March. And then, as we all know, the most bizarre things all started to happen. I hope that future economic development students learn about the toilet paper situation in terms of COVID-19. Who knew that toilet paper would become a sought after commodity around the globe? It is remarkable. So for us, we had some early indications back in February that things were going a bit pear-shaped from our forestry sector, and in particular, obviously with the China shutdown. As soon as things got serious in terms of New Zealand's position and lockdown, like all of you on the call, we stepped up into support mode. Loads of webinars, loads of newsletters. We set up a COVID portal on our website. I redeployed the entire team to work on business support. And we just got stuck in doing what we could to help our business community navigate such uncertain times. And then about 2 weeks into that, I got impatient. And for those of you who know me, you won't be surprised. Because we were obviously, and rightly so, incredibly focused on emergency and response mechanisms, but I wanted to start thinking about recovery. One of the things that we wanted to do up front was is to set up the lanes, and we all use this term. Don't know about you guys, my lanes looked a little bit more like that rather than the nice clear lanes. And I'd like to think they don't look like that, Susan, but possibly they still do. So we created a project structure in terms of this recovery piece, and we set it up like a project. We had a governance group, and those people at the top of the tree were the people that could actually make things happen. We didn't want anybody on that group that then had to go and ask somebody else to make something happen. They had to be the decision makers and the enablers. They had to own the plan, and they had to be responsible for ensuring it was delivered. We set up a steering group to report through to the project sponsor, and they became a touch point, sort of a reality check that the sponsor could use to make sure that what he was hearing was actually what was going on, and to provide some more diverse input into the process. And then a project team, the people on the tools doing the mahi, that's where I sat as researcher and writer for the project. But right across all three levels, we made sure that we had representation from the wider community. So we had obviously representatives from council, so councillors and the mayor at the top, and then council staff both in steering group and project group level. We had our economic development agency, obviously, our tourism organisation, our Main Streets group, our Chamber of Commerce, social services, iwi, education providers, and plenty of central government people from all the different departments, emergency response, police, business and industry. So what we wanted to do was get everybody ideally in their lane, and then we could start to figure out what we were doing. The first thing we did was figure out what we didn't know. And again, no surprise to any of you on the call, things were moving so quickly that trying to get a handle on what we did and didn't know changed often by the hour. So we commissioned Infometrics to run their forecast report, and when I received it, I actually cried. It was presenting a picture of 2,400 job losses, the bulk of those, 1,000 of those directly coming from tourism, again, no surprise. So we took that as our worst case scenario. Thanks Rob and Brad. And we then engaged with our community at large with a quite detailed business survey. We had over 500 respondents, and that gave us a really clear picture of actually what was the business perspective against the forecast. And we commenced a heap of direct engagement with industry to get some sector input in terms of what they were seeing, feeling, and experiencing. The other thing that we did at that stage was we created an open data portal. There's no surprises and there's no secrets in this space, and often trying to get hold of data, and people, do this silo thing and they patch protect and they don't share. We put everything we had up into this open space available for anybody to access, and whenever we harvested data from anywhere, we shared it with everybody because we wanted people to feel empowered to be able to find the information that they were needing to make their own decisions in their own businesses. So of course, all of this was done during lockdown. So we pulled out in early May what we called our State of the District report. That included a section that articulated the forecast scale of the impact, as I've just mentioned, that deep dive into our key sectors of our economy. And then we looked at emerging challenges across the four well-beings: social, economic, cultural, and environmental. And then we discussed some opportunities for action. The report was intended to stimulate discussion and to create conversation. It was intended to capture people's ideas and thinking. It didn't have any answers, it just had a whole lot of questions. What it did do is it created a thought piece and a talking piece that was then able to be used across the community. Our friends at council were able to use this report to add some depth to their applications, for example, in terms of the CIP process. We had a report that helped us explain what could happen if we didn't act. So just why did we go onto the four wellbeings approach? For us, it was very much a story of not for us, without us. And I guess my background coming through this business development and economic development space has always come from a more social lens and a community lens. And we'd run a very successful community-led economic development pilot in Mangakino a few years ago. And we knew that by gathering people together and uniting with a shared vision, we could not leave anybody behind on this journey. In terms of sort of academic behind that, we were blessed to have some support from Professor Dr. David Johnston, who leads Massey University's Disaster or Research Centre for Disasters in the Wellington campus. And Dr. David has done extensive research in how communities respond in terms of economic recovery through crisis and disaster. He's looked at things like, obviously, the Christchurch earthquakes, Kaikoura, but also looked at the impacts of terrorism acts around the world. And so he shared some learnings around what were some of the things that we should be cognizant of as we started to talk about medium and long-term recovery. One of the points he reinforced, which rang true to us and our community, was that the economic and social outcomes are intrinsically linked. You can't have economic outcomes that are positive without those also positively benefiting your community at large and therefore improving social outcomes. And the inverse, of course, applies. In terms of environmental, obviously COVID isn't really an environmental crisis as such. However, our environment in the Taupo district is the one thing that everybody holds tightly. We obviously have our beautiful lake, the heart of Te Ikia Maui, and the lifeblood of New Zealand in terms of power generation through the Waikato River. We take pride in our environment, and we saw, and then it was soon backed up, of course, by numerous central government interventions that support improving our environment as part of a COVID recovery. And lastly, cultural. It's a little bit harder to weave it into a strategy as such in terms of economic recovery. But what we did was we ensured that whatever we did, we acted with authenticity, with genuine engagement with our iwi leaders, and again, applying the nobody gets left behind philosophy so that everybody, regardless of where they lived in the district, whether they were Maori, Pākehā, Pacific Islander, Asian, or whomever found their way to our shores, they would all be able to see themselves and be a part of this process and benefit from the outcomes. So then again, nothing in terms of rocket science here. We set off on an engagement plan. And of course, no chance for face-to-face meetings or town hall meetings for engagement. So we had to do a whole lot of virtual stuff. We did do some billboards. I was on the radio a lot. We did a series of structured Zoom calls with stakeholder groups and phone calls. We went out to our young people through our schools and a lot of iwi engagement. We have 26 hapu within the Tūwhare Toa collective in Taupua, as well as a number of other iwi partners around the edges of the Taupo district that we all engaged with. And we asked them, as the image says, to share their ideas on how we can regenerate Taupo district. We weren't prescriptive. We didn't say, tick which one of these ideas you think is great. We were very much open-answered, open-ended questions, tell us what you think. So that all went remarkably well until this happened. And we found ourselves with over 1,000 separate pieces of engagement and feedback. Did I mention that there was no extra resource applied to this project and it was all on top of business as usual and all of our business support work we were doing? I'm not sure I did, but I know that many of you can relate to this. So on top of everything else, I had to sift through these responses to try and triage them. We tried to synthesize them into common themes and considered them individually and also collectively to identify those common themes. We identified what actions were already underway and therefore what gaps we wanted to address. One of the interesting pieces we had through this was harvesting Facebook, where people have shared the question or the post multiple times and trying to follow all of those threads to make sure that we captured everybody's input. And to me, this was probably the most important part of the whole process. I wanted to ensure that we honoured and respected all of those contributions. I think there's nothing worse than going out to a community and asking for input and then doing nothing with it and not respecting it for the way in which it's been presented. So how do we do that with 1,000 different bits of information? What we did was we broke that feedback into some component parts. We pulled out all of the, I'll put these in reverse order, but you get the idea. So what we did first actually was we looked at all of the short-term issues by sector that were being addressed, and we answered those off. So if somebody had identified an issue, we explained to them very clearly what was already happening about it, that we were onto it, that we'd seen it, that we'd recognised it was an issue for them, and we were doing something about it in a fully transparent and open way. We then looked at the short-term issues that weren't being addressed and looked at what some of the actions around those could be. We captured all of the ideas and opportunities for the future that will then go on to inform future work, which I'll speak about shortly. We listed all of the existing initiatives that were already underway, including central government funding and programs. And then we presented that back against, again, those 4 wellbeings, and I'll show you a couple of quick slides on that in a moment. In terms of the issues that weren't being addressed, we looked at those across a filter to try and, like I say, we couldn't do all the things that people thought were a good idea, or at least we couldn't do them in the short to medium term, which is the time frame we were considering. So we looked at the impact. Will the project or action create a significant positive impact? Against the influence and the immediacy of the action, could we actually use our influence to create an immediate result? We looked at the issue. Was the issue widespread, or was it actually quite narrow or granular in focus? And lastly, inclusivity. Does the action or project benefit a diverse cross-section of our community? So we did a spiderweb graphic across those 4 points of impact, influence, issue, and inclusivity. And we used that to help us triage and prioritise the actions we then recommended back to the community we undertook. Where we got to was an 8-pillar plan, and underneath those 8 pillars there are 40 actions. Again, all of those things were in addition to what was already being done. It was all extra work to help identify those issues and also to realise some of the opportunities that our community had identified. Most of the 40 actions we were able to put an owner against, but intentionally some of them we didn't. And we put the report out with a question mark against it saying, if this sounds like you, and you want to be a part of helping us find a solution for this issue, then get amongst it, join up. 2 of those areas were social housing and also community support. So looking after our most vulnerable. And that one, we were really aware that there are people in our community who are going to need to ask for help who have never had to ask for help before. They don't know where to go to find it. They're embarrassed to go and ask for help. We didn't want people to feel that they had to go hunting to get the help that they needed. We wanted to make it very public and visible. So the report's on the EDNZ website under the COVID resources. You're welcome to have a look. Very happy to answer any questions that you have. In terms of what we've been doing with it since then, of course, we have got, for my organisation, 22 of those 40 actions sit with Enterprise Great Lakes Taupō. So we've been trying to integrate those into our business plan for this coming year. We have set up a monitoring framework where we report back to the governance group on the progress of those 40 actions, and then we share that progress report with the public, with the wider community, and included in that is a dashboard of indicators in terms of what's happening across our community. This plan was intended to only be sort of a 6 to 12 month program of work. We intentionally didn't look long term, and the reason for that was multiple, but in a nutshell, things at this point in time, and again we're doing this work in June, things were moving so incredibly quickly and changing so quickly, we didn't feel we wanted to overthink a long-term solution. And Dr. David had constantly reminded us that economic recovery is a marathon, not a sprint. And whilst we'd sprinted to this short-term recovery phase, we knew that we were in here for the long haul. So what we have done in the report is we've included a number of themes, ideas and opportunities for the long term, and they've all now been carried through into other existing planning mechanisms. So obviously our council's going through their long-term plan at the moment. We're doing our 3-year strategic plan as the Economic Development Agency, and Ngāti Tūwharetoa have incorporated those themes into their strategy and work, as has our RTO where appropriate. So the themes haven't been lost, they've just been translated into existing structures of planning rather than creating yet another layer and level of planning and reporting. So just to close, and then very happy to take any questions. I've just thrown up a couple of shots on the screen. So this is how we presented back the data, like I say, in terms of that authenticity and transparency. So people raised an issue, we articulated the action that was already underway, very clear about who was doing it and who was involved in that play. So that if anybody had an issue or a question, they knew who to go to and who to ask the question. And we did that by sector, by issue that was raised. And then in terms of how we presented back those actions across the 4 wellbeings, we just did this very simple little tick chart where we showed and demonstrated how what we had listed as our 40 actions applied across the wellbeing framework. So very happy, I'll stop the screen share, and super happy, Patrick, to take any questions if there are any.
Great, Kylie, thank you very much. And the first point I was going to make is the same one that Pam Ford's just made on the kind of on the questions. That's the way that you've presented out the process and the way the plan's presented. It looks really good. Nice, simple way of moving it forward when everything's quite fluid at the moment and we need to move quickly. And as you said, it's, you know, could easily get caught up in a huge round of doing new strategies. So congratulations on that. I had a couple of questions, and then we'll see if any else come through. So first thing I was going to ask you about was, so she talked about the shock of seeing the Infometrics reports, and thankfully, as we all know, forecasts are forecasts, and you can kind of hopefully they won't all come true in quite that way. What did it tell you about the sort of, I guess, the underlying strengths or weaknesses in your local economy, and the sort of, we've been talking this week about balancing between diversification, specialization, and how do you develop those clusters that you've got, but how do you have that sort of more resilience in your economy? And was there anything when you looked at it you said, we better think about that?
Yeah, there definitely was, and I think I was foolish enough to be in this game through the GFC, and so I was able to kind of reflect back on what Taupō had experienced on the GFC, because these early signals that we were receiving were GFC-like. But for Taupō, we'd been really largely protected from the GFC. Obviously, the borders were still open, so the tourists were still coming, even if slightly, smaller numbers. But we had some significant infrastructure projects on the go that really helped our economy. So when I sort of looked back and reflected against that, we weren't that badly off after all. So when we got the Infometrics data, I think we always knew the tourism number was going to be large. We hadn't really expected it to be so significant, and especially across the accommodation sector. And it's probably one of those things where you get those numbers on a graph and you have a look at them, and we all get those reports, but I hadn't really paid enough attention to the fact that we've got 2,000 people literally just working in our accommodation sector, and so the opportunity to redeploy them or an opportunity for the moteliers to pivot their business were very limited. So that was one of those sort of stark moments of we really need to start thinking and acting about that now. I think in terms of clusters, obviously, as I mentioned in those earlier graphs, Taupō's been, has tourism as a core pillar of our economy. We're lucky that we've got others. We've got a very strong ag sector, a good forestry sector, and an increasingly productive and high yielding energy sector. We already had work underway in terms of fostering and strengthening the geothermal cluster, and this has highlighted the need to accelerate that work, which we're now doing as one of our sort of responses, as the Economic Development Agency. The other insight that I gained, I think, at that point, Patrick, was that so many people, this is going to sound slightly harsh, but really had no idea what economic development meant or how local economies worked. And I was bemused by that. the other insight we gained, which again, it reflects more about business support, but I was really alarmed at the lack of business capability across most of our SME sector. Again, I had expected more depth of capability, and it was, I think, alarming. And I know not just to me, because I've had this conversation with many of you on the call about how our business owners, and especially our small to medium owners, just didn't even know where to turn.
Yeah, I think one of those things that we've picked up, that as the RBP program's been thrown wider and more resources been made available, it's really uncovered a depth of how many businesses actually need that support and need that assistance. And so I think it's been a worthy investment that probably could have been made even before COVID. So the second question I was going to ask you was, obviously, we talked about the process and getting lots of that information back, and then, what do we do with it? And I guess the issue that's in my mind is, was there anything that surprised you? Obviously, you talked about, the role that you've been playing, you've been around for some time as an EDA. Was there anything that you saw that you went, oh, okay, that's interesting?
Yeah, I think there were a few things. I think one of the most surprising things, though, was actually the level of feedback and engagement. And so to me, that was a real signal of how serious the issue was, and that people were genuinely engaged and getting involved. Because, most of us, especially those of us that have been playing around the central government space for a while, or local government, know that you do this stakeholder engagement work, and you expect what you're going to get back, and you just receive what you get back. I think the input from, I'll pause on that. When we did the first sort of engagement phase, it became really clear that we weren't getting much of a voice from our younger residents. And as a mum of 3, I was really keen to ensure that we had a youth voice in there. And when we went out to the schools, both of our high schools in Taupō had their senior students and their leaders spend some time. They actually spent a whole afternoon just working through this process, and then provided some really engaging feedback. And it wasn't necessarily that there was anything overly insightful in there, but it gave me a huge amount of confidence that actually the kids got it. They understood that we had to be proactive, that we couldn't just sit back and wait. Many of the ideas that came up were already things that were potentially considered or underway, but we hadn't had a chance to socialise or get the good news out about. And then many people, again, not surprising, but reflective, was that everybody thought that somebody else would do it.
Yeah.
Lots of finger pointing about, but that's their job and that's their job. And whereas we were, alluding to my rather busy swimming pool analogy, we wanted everybody to realise that it was everybody's job.
Yeah. And now you're at that kind of interesting and challenging stage of kind of implementation of all of those things. And are you finding, and this relates to one of the questions that's come through, are you finding your stakeholders being prepared to align activities, to change what they're doing to support the plan?
In most part, yes, definitely. I think what we did do was we made sure that a lot of those enablers for change were around the table from the start. And we extensively workshopped the final draft of that plan with them, with the caveat being, this has got your name on it, so you own it. So when it comes out, people are going to hold you to account for enacting on these actions. So that certainly helped, rather than giving it to somebody and then expecting them to own it. I think one of the challenges that we've had, and again, it's no different everywhere else, is the speed at which the government interventions get announced, and then the haste at which they're implemented. And so we've got a lot of really good people really engaged to get stuck in and start doing some stuff, but the process behind that to actually enable it is stalling, and therefore we're losing some momentum, which is proving a bit tricky. The other challenge we've had in the early implementation is that we had a superb bounce back. Our July trading was the best on record. Our stats were through the roof. We had an amazing retail and visit for July. So that set up this level of complacency, which of course was then brought back into a harsh sense of reality with the Auckland shutdown. And so we're now dealing with this sort of emotional roller coaster, which again, we all knew was going to happen. But now it's suddenly feeling very real when people felt really comfortable and confident that everything was over. And I got accused of sort of being a naysayer and incredibly negative, often and frequently, until the middle of August, and then the conversation changed slightly. But trying to encourage our business owners to plan for this roller coaster ride that we're going to be on for some time to come yet, but still not let that preclude them from committing to investment and committing to bringing on new staff and continuing to grow and develop.
Good. And final question. You obviously mentioned at the start that you're one of the first sort of EDAs off the blocks in New Zealand, and obviously the role and nature of economic development's changed over that time. Given what you've sort of just learned over the last sort of couple of months, what do you think about how economic development and economic development agencies need to change going future?
It's a very challenging question for 3
o'clock.
But a great question nonetheless. I think one of the things that bemuses me about the sector is that whilst there's so many of us, we're all slightly different. And I guess that's a great reflection in terms of we're all working with different communities of interest, with different challenges in different communities. But you know, even similar sized communities of interest have got different economic development structures. And I'm not saying for a second that a one size fits all approach works, but I think there is some value to be gained in looking at what are the successful models. Michael alluded to this earlier in one of his slides about just even the difference in financing and financial structures of the different models. I think we need to be very open to working collaboratively, and I mentioned earlier that we work across all of those boundaries for our district because we are in the middle of 5 different territorial authorities. We consider that we'll be doing more and more of that work moving forward. We're a small community of 40,000 people. We can't resource the stuff that we need, so we need to work with our partners on that. So I think a little bit less patch protection, a little bit less fighting for what we believe is ours, and a little bit more of working together with a greater good, especially where there are commonality of industry interests. And again, our work with Bay of Connections, we do a lot of work in the Bay in terms of geothermal, for example, whereas we don't do a lot of work in the Waikato for geothermal, but we do a lot of work in the Waikato for dairy. So, you know, and then a lot of work with Ruwhiu for tourism. So it's about, to me, strengthening those regional alliances without overcomplicating it with lots more structure is a biggie. And then I think the government has done some really good work in terms of encouraging regional specialisation, which I know has been a common topic this week. And sometimes I feel like that's slightly over-engineered because of the competitive environment we found ourselves in with the Provincial Growth Fund, although Marshall Jones earlier may disagree with that comment. And so I think an opportunity for the industry as economic development practitioners to actually also have a voice in terms of what that regional specialisation could or should be. So it's sort of bottom up rather than potentially top down would be my 3 p.m. on a Friday bits of feedback.
That's pretty good for 3 p.m. on a Friday, Kylie. Kylie, thank you so much for taking up that last slot, but you haven't let us down, so that's been really useful. I hope you've enjoyed the week, and I hope everybody on the call's enjoyed the week. It's my pleasure now to hand back to Pam Ford, Chair of EDNZ, to formally close us down.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Patrick. Gosh, we started the week with Shamaville, and he talked about already 73,000 people out of jobs. And he said we have to prepare for a marathon. So not only a marathon in terms of our recovery, but also the marathon that most of you have been on this week, enjoying, I hope, what has been an incredible array of speakers. So, and finishing off there with Kylie, that was fantastic. I was so impressed with the amount of work that you got through and what you've produced. It looks really, really exciting. So Taupo is in very good hands with your EDA. Big thank you to Patrick, guiding us through the week, asking the insightful questions. I'm glad that I'm not going to get those tricky questions from him again, because we can all go and have a beer after this. And a big thank you to Susan for putting it all together and making sure that we were all able to jump on the sessions when we wanted to. Just a few thoughts from some of the sessions during the week. The other thing that Shaman Bill said, which I've heard before, and it's something that I've said to my team a few times, and it was reflected back to me yesterday by one of them who's been on these calls, that, you know, as EDAs, we need to do what we do best, and it's around inform, coordinate, and communicate, which is, you know, more important than ever during this time of uncertainty. I was on a call this morning. I have a regular Friday session for the Auckland Business Roundtable, it's called, with MSD and MB and EMA and the Chamber and the Restaurant Association was on there, and Marissa, who runs that organisation, said for members who, of course, are right across the country, the biggest thing is the uncertainty, and the uncertainty for all of the businesses that we're dealing is very real. So the first thing was, you know, Shaman Bill talking about focus, it's a marathon. Similarly, Ganesh talked about, don't worry, I'm not going to go through every presentation, it just happens that these two on the first day really captured me. He talked about the strength of community connection. So he also talked about central government must fund local government more, and that's certainly something that we on the board of EDNZ are looking at, how we can engage better with central government to represent all of you in the regions, all of our members, and ensuring that as we go into this next phase of government, the next cycle, that the regions continue to be well served, those that have been under PGF, and then those that haven't, and the metro areas are also well served. And that was picked up by Minister Twyford in his address also. A third point was around the practicality. There was a lot of practical sessions this week, and Harvey Brooks talked about the brilliant recovery document that we all have access to through EDNZ that was put together by Martin Jenkins and Cities and Regions and someone else I've just forgotten, sorry. But anyway, it's online, as a great resource for all of you. And Harvey also talked about the psychological stages of recovery. So that's a very important point, because as we, you know, heading into the 6 months of dealing with this issue, it does become tiring. So we've got to be sure to look after ourselves. I like what E4 talked about around an emphasis on the startup culture and being opportunity ready and focusing on regional transformation as opposed to just industry transformation, which I know that rings bells with this audience for sure. And talking about workload, Kylie just talked about that. Huge amount of work was done to prepare the regional plan. And as did Carolyn Tremaine, you know, reminding us about the huge amount of work that MB has had to run through over the last few months, and going at pace, supplying ministers with so much well-informed information from the regions, from businesses. She talked about 50+ cabinet papers during this time, how the wage subsidy was set up so quickly, amongst many other programs. So, you know, big ups to MB for really working so hard through this time to try and look after our businesses. But we do, as we all know, have a long way to go. And as Shaman Bill said, we've got to prepare for a marathon. So I'm really pleased that so many people took the time to stop and reflect during this week. I've had great feedback from some of my team that have been on many of the sessions, and I just say, as I did on Monday, as Mayor Angelo says, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. So hopefully you've learned a few practical things during this week, and you can go out and do better in your respective roles of helping all of us to recover through this health and economic crisis that we're in the middle of. Have a wonderful weekend. I think you all deserve to have a bit of a tools down and rest and recover over the next few days as we then get back into business on Monday and continue the great work. Kia kaha, kia ora tātou, and I will see you again. Thank you very much. I think, Patrick, are you going to sign out, or you sign everyone out, or have a final say?
Thanks, Pam. No, nothing else from me other than thanks all very much. And I'm sure that the video from today, Susan, will get that put up over the weekend as well. So closing off for now, and hopefully to see you all in Palmerston North in early next year. So Susan, back to you.
One other revelation.
Thank you so much, Patrick and Pam. That's a wonderful way to end the week. Patrick, thank you so much for your emceeing. It's been inspiring. And yes, we EDNZ owes you a lot. Thank you, not money, but thank you very much. See you all next time. Bye bye.
Thanks, Susan.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Well done. You can have a rest.
Actually, I'm going down to Bunnings and the flower shop to get some plants and diving into the garden and getting off my backside.
Oh, good. That sounds great.
Yeah.
Well, I'll touch base with you next week once you've recovered, yeah?
Yeah. Well, you're on leave next week, aren't you?
No, I'm away on Friday. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Great. Yeah, we've got a meeting on Monday, I think, so see how we go. Anyway, you have a great weekend, and I'll end the meeting.
Okay, thanks, Susan.
Bye.